Hi guys, and welcome back to Brain-Friendly Thinking. If you want to dive deep into a topic or problem, you need to take in a lot of information. But information is just that. Information. In order to utilize what you read and to develop original thoughts, you need to process that information. Sort it, structure it, and link it to other knowledge you already possess. Today I'm going to show you how brain-friendly tools can help you with that, using the example of a book I recently read. The book which I'm post-processing is called Next Practice by Peter Kruse. It's a book about complexity and especially how companies can adapt to change in a world that becomes more and more complex. Unfortunately, as far as I know at least, this book hasn't been translated to English yet, which is a real shame, because you can learn a lot about complex systems from that book. It's a very good introductory text. As I was reading this book, I created an ABC Active, as I usually do when reading, and I have already done several videos where I show the process, so I will not go into any details here. If you're interested, you can click the video here. But when I finished reading the book, all I had was a list of keywords, more or less alphabetically sorted. And for some of the keywords, I immediately knew why I had written them down, and other keywords I had to do a bit more thinking before I could remember. So now I wanted to take the information from the book and I wanted to transform it specifically into zettels that I could store in my zettelkasten. Because you might be actually tempted to take over as much information as possible. But that just leads to information overload. Rather, limitation is the key. Only take over what is really essential. Only take over what really enriches and contributes to your train of thoughts and to the ideas you already had before. Or what starts a completely new train of thought. But as I was processing that information, there were always these three leading questions in my mind. What is important? How are the ideas linked together? And how can I concentrate it into a zettel? So now I finished reading the book, and this is where we start. So I finished reading the book, I got my ABC Active here, filled to the brim with concepts and with names, and now I go and I group these words into different categories. So let's see, what have we got? One of the things that was very important in the book was best practice. Best practice versus next practice. And so I go through the words that I collected for the first time. Now for a lot of words I might not remember what they mean straight away, but there are some for which I do remember. That's where I start. I start putting them into categories. For the others, I go over them again and again. And for most of them, at some point I will remember. First vaguely, then more and more strongly. And so over time more and more words will end up in one category or the other. And at the same time it's a very good way of retrieving the words and of remembering why I wrote them down. Because in order to put them into a category, you really need to understand what they mean and why you wrote them down. Next I take the words from the ABC list which I just categorized, and I take my time to rewrite them into new lists according to which category I place the words into. So I have one new list for each category. This might seem a little bit pointless and like a waste of time. However, if you're careful about this, if you're really doing that actively, I found that it really helps you to think through the text on a much deeper level. You again retrieve what you've done before. And as I'm doing it, I sometimes find that my first categorization was wrong and I now put the word into a different category where it much rather belongs to. Or sometimes I take a word and I put it into both categories. And as I'm doing that, I sometimes get completely new ideas, which I then write down by themselves, and then I continue with the lists. It's very strange, you wouldn't think that this should be the case, but it is really an active working process. After having processed the content of the book in this way, I wanted to make a summary of the most important argument. And for that I decided to make a CaWas. One of the important things of a CaWas is to decide on the central word where all the other words branch off from. And in this case, it really wasn't easy. I thought about several possibilities and finally I settled on instability. According to the author, instability will increase because globally things are more and more interconnected with one another. Higher interconnection density also means a larger speed of change. And that requires next practice, which is one of the central concepts of the book. But once I had down next practice, I immediately felt the urge to also put in best practice, which is the other important concept and the opposite of next practice. Best practice is what you want to do if you have stability. So my central word was instability, but then I said when stability, then best practice, and that somehow didn't really fit. So I put the CaWas away and I started a new CaWas. And after a little bit more mulling over, I decided to use dynamics instead of instability. Once I decided on dynamics, things started to fall into place. Phase transition requires next practice. Structure exploitation requires best practice. And there needs to be a strategic balance between the two. The dynamics is driven by the interconnection density, which increases. That leads to a higher speed of change. And it also leads to an increased probability that the changes will be avalanches. The changes are driven by circular causality, and next practice means adapting to a new reality. That requires an iterative approach to explore the new search space and emotion management. And so my CaWas is able to capture all of the central concepts of the book and put them into relation to one another. Now, as I processed the content of the book in this way, I was always on the lookout for what are the important concepts and how can I group them in order to write my zettels. After having them processed in several different ways by now, there were certain things I was already certain that I wanted to create a zettel about that. There were other concepts I thought of knew I wanted to write a zettel about, but I was not quite sure yet what I should put into the zettel. So in order to get a better understanding of what the zettel should contain, I went back to categorizing. This time not all of the words from ABC Active, but I went to specific lists and focused on those. For some of them, I actually went through and I categorized all the words. For some other lists I only went and I marked the most important words. Doing all this processing gave me an idea which I could not clearly see before. One of the central aspects of the book is that we're living in a world that is more and more interconnected. There are certain developments that lead towards that. Now that we are connected, there are certain dynamics that come from that, and there are certain consequences of this development. For each of the three aspects, development, dynamics, and consequences, I went through my previous lists and I selected those concepts that are most critical to these aspects. At first, again, that was not quite so easy. But after going back and forth a couple of times between the lists, the whole idea became clearer and clearer in my mind. But reading through the list now, they make the ideas that I had before much more concrete, much more specific. And therefore it is now much easier for me to talk about the idea and to put it into words. What these thinking tools allow us to do is to find the essentials of a text or an idea and how the different parts interact with one another. This understanding is important if we want to write good zettels. So now I pivoted from exploring the text with lists and categorization in CaWas to actually writing the zettels themselves. But by this time I had a plan in my mind what information was worth taking over into my zettelkasten. Now at first I was writing digital zettels and I tried to follow the principle of atomicity and everything. Here you can see, for instance, the zettel which I wrote for next practice. I said next practice is the conscious management of phase transitions within an organization. This is a period of uncertainty, instability, and reduced performance. See critical slowing down. Since the correct path is not knowable, it requires active exploration and frequent changes of how things are done. Requires strategic balance with best practice. You see, there are also certain concepts which I discuss in other zettels, so I link to them. Phase transition or best practice. I wrote this zettel in December 2021, now it's April 2022. And in the meantime there has been a big change in the way I'm doing zettelkasten. Mainly I switched from a digital system to an analog system. Why I did this and why I think that's better is a topic for another video. So let's not dwell on how I did things back then, but see how am I doing things now. So this is my zettelkasten. It's got 2 sections plus the index here in the back. The first section is about systems, the second section is about thinking. And actually the zettels from the book, they are spanning both sections. Now first I need to go to systems control 1.4, And here we got the first zettel, management of instability. This zettel is actually a summary of the main argument of the book. It reads, over the past couple of decades, the global interconnection density has increased greatly. In the resulting network, any change introduced can ripple far and also loop back to feedback onto the element that caused the change in the first place. This results in a nonlinear system where the speed of change is increased and the magnitude of changes has avalanche potential. Whenever such a fundamental change has occurred, any company affected by the change needs to adapt its internal structure to survive and strive. To do so successfully requires a strategic balance between two fundamental management strategies, best practice and next practice. And you can actually see that survive and thrive has got a little a here, which is a link to another card, and also 1 and 2 in this little list here, they're also linked to other cards. And if I flip through, then here we got best practice. Best practice optimizes function in stable states. And behind that I have next practice. Next practice changes function during phase transition. And for each of them I say what they actually are. And you can say survive and thrive has a little superscript A here, which links to another card, in this case the card that's right behind it. Possible ways for company to adapt to dynamic markets. This is actually not something from the book itself. These are just some ideas I got from processing all the information, and I filed it here. That means that I enrich this first thought now. If I go further, I have here next practice changes function during phase transition. Another thought from the book also relates to that, and that is emotional management, important component of change management. So usually when we think about change management or changes, we just think about some technological aspect or structural aspect, but Kruse makes the important point that any type of change is always accompanied by emotions. So I file this as a separate zettel, which actually belongs to next practice. And then this is actually from the book, but you see after the emotional management, something interesting happened, because soon after I listened to a talk where some people talked about how ABC lists can be used for emotional management. And then I thought, it was very interesting, so I wrote it down. In which way can they be used? This is basically from the talk. But I thought, well, that fits quite well with what Kruse said about emotional management. This is sort of, how can it be done practically? So I filed this thought, these ideas which I got from the talk, after the ideas from the book. And then, as I was reading through another book, How to Solve It by George Polya, he also talks about emotional management, even though he doesn't call it emotional management. But he says, when we're solving problem, emotions are very important. So to keep going needs a lot of emotional management. He talks about this from the point of view of a teacher. But again, I thought this is actually something that is very closely related to this emotional management that Kruse talks about. So I also filed it here. And then just a couple of days ago, actually, when listening again to a small documentary about Feynman from 1973, in there Richard Feynman and Fred Hoyle, among other things, they discussed how it is to discover new things, how to solve problems in science. And they made a very interesting point. They say it's the hope to suddenly being able to see the solution and the excitement that comes with this. The hope for the excitement that keeps a scientist going, which in itself is a very beautiful illustration of what Polya talks about in his book and why he mentions emotional management in the context of solving problems. So I filed it behind emotional management and problem solving, which again is filed under emotional management in change management. going back to our first zettel, right down here you see and see also note. This is a long distance link. So this long distance link actually goes to section 2 of my zettelkasten, which is thinking 2.1/5. 2 is thinking, and 2.1 is innovation. Yeah, I got a lot of zettels, 2.1/4, 2.1/4/5. There we go. And this one links to the concept of future readiness. Future readiness needs to be actively acquired. This is not a thought by Kruse, this is a thought by Vera F. Birkenbiel, which she talks about in her book Birkenbiel on Management. And she says, advances in development are accompanied by phases of instability. That's actually also something that Kruse talks about. So Kruse talks about that if the circumstances are changing, we need to switch from best practice to next practice. But this is very related, even though she didn't know Kruse, and I'm pretty sure Kruse didn't know Birkenbiel. This little train of thought here, which might grow in the future, goes very well together with the train of thought that Kruse started. So I linked them together. And there you see, even though this is still quite a small zettelkasten, but already you see how different ideas start to be interlinked. And so you see how the information from the book ended up in my zettelkasten. There were a couple of other zettels which I wrote, some of them not as richly connected as the ones which I showed to you. However, I think you get the gist of what I'm doing. The important thing is, if you read the book and think through it and develop the zettels, you might end up with different zettels than me. Or even if you end up taking over some of the same information that I did, you will write about this in a completely different way and you will connect it in a completely different way. That's fine, that's how it should be. Because these are your thought processes. These are your ideas which you're enriching. And since you're different from me, so too your results will differ from mine. That is absolutely natural, and it actually shows that real thinking has taken place. If you just take what you read in the book and you copy it one-to-one to your zettelkasten, that's not thinking. You don't want to do this because, well, then what is the point taking it over? It's already there in the book, you can always go back and reread it. No, you want to think it and you want to enrich your thoughts or start new trains of thought. Of course, these are not the only thinking tools there are. There are many more that you can use, and some thinking tools will be more useful in certain contexts or for certain type of information than others. I already made another video where I post-process the information I gained from a book. Although that was more open-ended, that was not with the aim of taking the information and installing it in a zettelkasten. However, if you want to get more ideas of what you can do to post-process a book, you can watch the video here. Or if you want to get an overview about all of the thinking techniques and many more that you can use, you can watch the playlist right here. Otherwise, if you found this video useful, please don't forget to give the like button a high five. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And until next time, keep thinking.